So this is my topic, Indigenous Material Culture and Identity. So the basic question that I hope we could answer today is, what is the relationship between material culture and identity? So in this picture, that's me, of course, with a replica of the Manunggul jar. And the Manunggul jar is an artifact found in Palawan. And of course, later I'll distinguish an artifact from material culture. But basically, it's still material culture. So these are the concepts that I would like to define first. Some of them technical definitions, others purely using an definition coming from the dictionary. So we hope to level off on the concepts of culture, on material culture, on what is indigenous, and what is identity. As an anthropologist, I will be discussing culture from an anthropological point of view. So in this picture, you see Sir Edward Burnett Tylor, a British anthropologist. He was the first one to give to us a scientific definition of what culture is in his book, Primitive Culture, published way back in 1871. So according to Tylor, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So let us look at some important keywords. First, man or human beings, because only humans have culture. This is what distinguishes humans from non-humans. Non-humans do not have culture. At best, they have instinct or protoculture in the case of some uh, apes and monkeys. So it is something that they learn, but is not passed on from generation to generation. Another important keyword is society, because when we talk of culture, we will talk about something that is shared. We are not talking about individual behavior here, but group behavior shared by a group of people, such as a community, a family, a tribe, a nation, etc. Another important keyword is acquired, because culture is not inherent, it is not innate. It is something that we learn through a process known as enculturation, as anthropologists call it, or socialization, as most social scientists use. We learn culture from our elders, from our peers, from our government, from the church, from mass media, as we grow up into the particular group where we belong. And what consists of culture is very complex, such as art, morals, belief, etc. Everything that is man-made belongs to culture. If it is not man-made, it belongs to nature. But once humans fashion these non-man-made things, they become culture. And what is, according to Clyde Cloghon in his book Mirror for Man, he points out to us that there are five component parts of a cultural system. So why did he call it as a system? Because it is a complex whole that is intertwined with one another. All cultural systems have an environmental setting, a group or society that possesses that particular culture, human activities and behavior, cultural tradition, which is basically human activities and behavior, but that which is passed on from generation to generation. And lastly, material culture. And this is the topic that we are going to talk about. So let us define material culture. And I would also like to say that even the environment, group, society, human activities, cultural tradition would have expressions in terms of material culture. So, in the information about this webinar, you probably already read this passage from Gaskell and Carter in the Oxford Handbook on Material Culture. So, according to these authors, they said, we take material culture to be physical entities that resonate with communities of humans. They may be things, including living things, that humans adapt from nature and modifying them. Or they may be things that humans select and adopt from nature in a physically unmodified form, incorporating them into cultural practices constituted by a consistent set of assumptions and behaviors shared by a viable human community. So that's quite a lengthy definition of material culture, but this would be clearer once I give examples. Okay. So this is one basic example. So we know that a bamboo tree or a bamboo stand, technically it's not a tree because it's grass, belongs to living things. Okay. But humans have fashioned them. They have cut them and made them into bamboo houses and other objects used by humans. So in this case, the picture on the right shows a lime container used by the Tagbanwa of Palawan. The lime is placed here, which is used for betel nut chewing. And you will see that there are inscribed texts in the Tagbanwa script. Right now, I don't know what it means, but basically it was cut from a nodule of a bamboo because it is hollow inside. They put the lime or apob in Filipino inside this container. So from bamboo, which is not material culture, it belongs to nature. But once humans have modified it and used it for humans' purposes, it has become material culture. Another example is something that is unmodified, and most Filipinos, especially those of the older generation, would recognize this. So the picture on the left shows natural stones, river stones. But humans selected certain pieces of these stones and used them as panghilod. Uh, I don't know the exact English translation. Something to scrape your body to clean your body while taking a bath or shower. So this stone is unmodified. And once you see it in nature, you will not probably know whether it was used or unused as material culture and eventually abandoned by the earlier settlers of that particular area. So it may be modified or unmodified. Of course, the modified ones are easily recognizable to us. Now, what is an artifact? Uh, an artifact refers to an object made by a human being, typically an item of cultural or historical interest. Therefore, based on that definition, the two terms, material culture and artifact, are basically synonymous. Because here we will be talking about indigenous material culture, and these are, of course, culturally significant to particular societies. In this case, indigenous communities in the Philippines. Now, the term artifact is more commonly used by archaeologists. That is why, for laymen, the term is commonly associated with things of the past, while most anthropologists would use material culture to refer to objects being used at present. But we could use the terms interchangeably, like a building can be a megalithic artifact. So it's a big uh, object that was modified by human beings. Now, why did I include the term artifact here? Because later I shall show to you that certain types of material culture are found on the ground, excavated by archaeologists. And once we interpret them, we are able to associate them with objects that were used by particular indigenous communities. Secondly, borrowing from archaeology, let me share to you some concepts as well with regards to distinction of different types of artifacts. Now, according to Louis Binford, an American anthropologist, in his book Archaeology as Anthropology, he distinguished three types of artifacts: technomic artifacts, sociotechnic artifacts, and idiotechnic artifacts. Technomic artifacts are utilitarian objects, such as a stone tool. And for many laymen, usually when they hear the word artifact, they think about utilitarian objects. They think about tools, like an adze, a chopper chopping tool, a spearhead or an arrowhead, etc. But we usually neglect the two types of other artifacts. Sociotechnic artifacts are artifacts depicting social relations. For example, a king's crown is a sociotechnic artifact. It is not equivalent to a hat. A hat is a technomic artifact. It is something that you use to protect you from sunlight. But a king's crown doesn't protect you from sunlight. It is show the power of the king towards his subjects. And unfortunately, some archaeologists always interpret artifacts as utilitarian objects. Now, if we're talking about material culture and identity, we will be very interested in understanding sociotechnique artifacts, those that relate to, is this specific artifact depicting the ethnic identity of that particular group. A third type of artifact, according to Binford, are idiotechnique artifacts, or artifacts reflecting belief systems or ideology. For example, a rosary is an artifact. Now, it shows it is not utilitarian. It shows the user's relationship with God or his religion. Okay, so another concept that we have to define is indigenous, so that we're clear what we're talking about here. In the dictionaries or any dictionary that you may want to consult, the term indigenous just means original or native to a place. So in our discussion, there may be two types of what we mean by indigenous. First, indigenous as an adjective to material culture, that is a material culture that is indigenous to a particular area. For example, if I saw a kudyapi, a native guitar, is it indigenous to that particular ethnic group, or did they borrow it? So if it was simply borrowed, it's not indigenous. But a second definition is material culture possessed by indigenous people. And I would like to believe that we are more interested in this. We are not interested in material culture that is original, not necessarily so, because there are certain material culture objects that have been borrowed by certain groups from outside groups, but use them for their internal purposes. So we're more interested in the second one, material culture possessed or owned, used by indigenous people. Of course, I would limit my discussion to indigenous peoples of the Philippines. Now, the last concept that we have to define is identity. Identity, of course, is a psychological concept. According to the psychologist Herbert Harris, identity refers to an individual's sense of uniqueness, of knowing who one is and who one is not. So a perfect example will be an identification card. It shows who you are, what is your name, what is your social security number, where are you working, who is your nearest relative to contact in case there's an accident. So it shows this is a material object, material culture that reflects an individual's identity. But again, in this webinar, I think we are interested in shared identities of a group of people. So we are interested in social identities. So a social identity is an identity that is shared by a particular group, no matter what that group is. If it is made up of at least two or more people, then and shared by the members of that group, then it is part of social identity. Examples of social identity are gender identity, class identity, ethnic identity, community identity, professional identity, national identity, and so on and so forth. There are many types of social identities. Now, in this discussion tonight, we are interested in material culture of indigenous peoples where that particular object or objects reflect their group's identity. So basically, ethnic identity of indigenous people. So what is ethnic identity? So I borrowed this definition from Cyan Jones in his book, Archaeology of Ethnicity. According to Jones, ethnic identity refers to that aspect of a person's self-conceptualization which results from the identification with a broader group in opposition to others on the basis of perceived cultural differentiation and or common descent. So it's a matter of perception and it may be real or imagined. And the basis of that identification with a group that differentiates that group with others is probably because of common descent, such as having a common ancestor. So I noticed a while ago we have right now participants representing a particular ancestral domain in Davao City. I think it's a Tagabawa group. So they have a common ancestors. That is why they have a territory they call ancestral domain. So that's one, common descent. Now again, that may be imagined because the common ancestor may be a mythical hero such as in the Cordillera, they may say we all came from Bugan and Lumawig. So they are culture heroes of the Ifugaos, for example. Also, a factor will be cultural differentiation. Where are you similar with each other, such as having the same phenotypic appearance? Pareho bang maitim? Pareho bang kulot ang buhok? Or is it common native attire, common language, common weapons, as opposed to others? Now I know this is somewhat problematic because there may be things that are unique to your own group, but there are also certain cultural traits that your groups share with others. And again, I would like to show examples of that. Okay. I'll show that later. Now, in this webinar, we are talking about the relationship between material culture and identity. Now, let me cite from Victor Botchley, where he says, material culture can be described as any object that humans use to survive. So, yun yung technomic, no? Define social relationships, yun yung social technique. Represent facets of identity or benefit people's state of mind, social or economic standing. So, represents identity. From that material culture, it is a symbolic representation of one's group. It may not be apparent to outsiders, but for the members of that in-group, they may be proud of this type of material culture. Or it may be the other case around. Outsiders view that, the members of that group, they use these particular objects, unlike us. Okay. So, that relationship may be explicit or inferred. So let me give you two examples. The Philippine flag, which is material culture because it's made of textile, colored textiles with red, white, blue, and yellow. So it is an explicit identity marker of who Filipinos are. So in this photograph, so it's the Philippine flag during the Olympics opening ceremony way back in 2012 in London. And it is Heidelin Diaz carrying the flag. So it's something explicit. But most material culture objects are not explicit, but the outsider tries to infer or interpret that particular object. For example, if we go to a beach in Palanan, Isabela, we may find this shanties, technically called lean-to because they lean on a pole, which may have been abandoned. So there's no one we could ask, what is this used for? But basically, we know that it is a lean-to or a house of Agta. It's a group of Negritos in coastal Isabela, in Palanan, Makunakon, Divilacan. They use this type of house. So it is made of light materials, wood and leaves, because the Agta are able to carry it around if they have to relocate. And based on studies, the nomadic Agta of Palanan, Isabela move about every 3 weeks at the average. So they carry their house with them as well as the very few objects that they own. If it is rainy season, they place the lean-to underneath the shade of the forest trees. But if it's sunny, they are along the beach area. So the Agta call them buhanginan. It depends on where the sunshine is. The lean-to rotates to protect the inhabitants from too much sunlight. So for anthropologists, we know only the Agta use such type of houses in the Philippines. Probably in the prehistoric past, this was used by many Filipinos, but many other Filipinos have become sedentary already and abandoned a house style such as the lean-to. So it is more identifiable with the Agta. So these are concepts related to being explicit or inferred. Now, remember this photograph. So this is the famous bilao from Pottery Barn, which was sold in the US online for equivalent to 15,000 pesos. So many Filipinos were found this too ridiculous because we know this is very, very cheap. It could be bought in the market. So for Americans, it is a an ornament. It's a wall decoration. But for many Filipinos, we could easily identify, that's bilao, that is made in the Philippines. And that is very cheap. So in this case, it is the outsiders, in this case, Filipinos, because the insiders are Americans, who are able to identify a an object that represents Filipino identity. Okay. Okay, so let me share to you first, before going to indigenous material culture, some studies that I was involved with. Since I'm a resident of Pasig and I saw in the chat box there's someone from Buting Senior High School here, or Buting Elementary School, also in Pasig. So Pasig in the historical past was known as a town that produced earthenware pots. It was mentioned in archival documents as way back in the 17th century, Pasig was already producing earthenware pots. But way back in 2004, if I remember right, I did research among Pasig potters. One of the potter is shown in this picture. And when I interviewed them, they are able to identify, based on a heap of pots, which pots were made by certain individuals. So they could say, ako ang gumawa nito. And I said, how did you know? Because I left certain markers within the pot that based on a style of production that I myself do, such as in the style of forming the clay at the base or at the mouth. So it could be a marker of the individual potter. But at the same time, they told me once already in the market, they could distinguish if certain earthenware pots came from their factory or not. So the factory that I studied, which no longer exists, is Irene Glen Pottery. They could say these pots were made by potters from Irene Glen. And because the clay is very thick, it's relatively flat, so it becomes an identity marker for the potters of that particular pottery factory. Okay. And this is something very interesting to me because this will help archaeologists, for example. An archaeologist digging on the ground, and for example, if he finds several earthenware pots, he may be able to say how many potters produced these pots based on different styles. Were they made by individual specialists or made by a group of people? That is something that can have an application for archaeologists. Another study that I was involved in, and of course, this is now more related to the topic that we are going to discuss, is related to my PhD dissertation on Ichananao ethnic identity. The Ichananao are Kalinga people from the village of Dananao in Tinglayan, Kalinga. And they call themselves as Ichananao, which just means people of Dananao. Okay? Now, they have certain objects that they possess, such as necklaces, heirloom bead necklaces worn by this Kalinga woman, their skirts, their gongs, etc. Now, here is a direct passage from my dissertation. So it's in Filipino. Sorry for those who don't understand Filipino. But they told me, may gamit din ang mga material na kultura at sining ng mga Ichananaw, hindi lamang para patampukin ang identidad ng pagiging Ichananaw, kundi para rin palakasin ang kumon na identidad ng pagiging Kalinga. So there are material culture that is unique to the Ichananaw, but there are also material culture objects that are shared by the Ichananaw with other Kalinga groups, such as the neighboring Itorcao, Itong Rayan, and even those in the capital of Tabuk. So there is local identity and there is a pan-Kalinga identity. So let me go to that concept of unique identity and shared identity. Okay. So in the Philippines, one of the famous musical instruments that we have, of course, this is something shared with our neighbors from Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, is the gong. Now, we will be able to distinguish two types of gongs in the Philippines. First is the flat gong, shown in the picture on the left, which in the Cordillera region in northern Philippines is called gangsa. So it's a brass gong, it's flat, and usually the old gongs, the handle of the gong is made of a human jawbone, panga ng isang tao. Whose jawbones are this? Jawbones of enemies that, in this case, this was in Kalinga, that the Kalingas have killed because they were enemies. When I asked them, who were these enemies? They said, they were the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. But they may be enemy tribes as well. Okay? So if you see flat gongs in the Philippines, you know they come from northern Philippines, more particularly in the Cordillera region. But if you see, sorry, what is called as bossed gongs, B-O-S-S-E-D, bossed gongs. In my translation in Filipino, pasensya na sa translation ko, this is gong na may utong, with a nipple. So it is not flat, also made of brass or it may be bronze, but there is a round nipple-like centerpiece there. So usually the term will be agong. It may be as big as this one or smaller, such as the one at the back on the ground. It can be in an ensemble, parang xylophone. So if you see bossed gongs, they come from Visayas and Mindanao. I've seen this also among the Bukidnon in Mount Canlaon. So it's not a flat gong, but a bossed gong. So can we say if the flat gong is Ifugao or Kadinga or Bontok? From an outsider's point of view, not necessarily, because they look similar and because they are shared. Can we tell if this gong is from Maguindanao, Maranao, Tawsu, Yakan, Iranun, or maybe I saw such gongs among the Iranun of Sabah. So, but when I interviewed them, they told me also they came from Mindanao, brought into Sabah by our ancestors. So they are shared within a particular broader culture area. So material culture can be unique to a particular group or shared to a group of people. Now, probably we are more interested in those that are unique to particular groups. And I will give some examples. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list of examples because our time is very limited. But the more common ones that we know. Okay. First is bows and arrows that are commonly identified with the Aita. The Aita is a Negrito group of Central Luzon. The picture that you see on the right are Aita hunters from Zambales, uh, published in a book by William Reed in 1901 on the Aitas of Zambales. It is more easily identifiable to the Aita and other Negrito groups because most other indigenous peoples of the Philippines use a spear or a sword or a blowgun, but the Aita up to now use bows and arrows. So that's it. If you see bows and arrows, probably it's Negrito, probably it's Aita. Okay? So I'm just giving examples and I'm doing it alphabetically from A to, I think, to Y. Now, the picture that you see is a Badjao houseboat called Lepa by the Sama Dilaut or the Badjao. Of course, the Badjao are not just found in Sulu and Tawi-Tawi, but also found in Sulawesi in Indonesia and in Sabah, now a territory of Malaysia. So it is something that is shared. If you see such houseboats, we know, it must be Bajau. And they live there, they sleep there, they cook there. And of course, even their mythology of where they came from, where did our ancestors come from, is very much related to the houseboat. According to the Bajau, they came from Melaka in Malaysia. One time, they were about to sleep, so they tied several houseboats on a piece of rock found on the sea so that the houses won't just float anywhere. So that was in Malacca. But when they woke up, they found themselves in Tawi-Tawi, only to realize that it was not a piece of rock, but it was a giant turtle that navigated from Malaysia to the Philippines. Of course, you will say, that's a myth. That's just folklore. But still, folklore is part of culture, it's part of tradition, it's part of identity. So even the Bajau, their identity is very much tied with their houseboats. Now, this is a piece of bamboo where there is Hanunoo Mangyan script etched on the bamboo, and what is inscribed is a poetry known as Ambahan. So, sorry, I think the picture is quite blurred, but on the left, you will see the text in Hanunoong Mangyan, si ay pod by u pod an, okay? And that's the translation in English. You, my friend, dearest of all, thinking of you makes me sad. Now, the Hanunoo Mangyan usually write on pieces of bamboo. They may be cut from bamboo or they may be in bamboo stands or strands. So nasa puno ng bamboo along a trail. If someone is walking along a trail and sees a bamboo strand, so he inspects that group of bamboo and he may notice graffiti on it, which may turn out to be a love poem written to a Hanunoo Mangyan girl whom he knows would pass by that trail. So the bamboo again is belongs to living things, but once the Hanunoo Mangyan inscribes on it, it becomes a canvas. It is now a piece of material culture. Let's go to Ifugao Bulul. Okay, so uh, the, the picture on the left shows two sitting bululs. Some definitions say this is a rice granary god. Of course, many Ifugaos would say, no, that's not a god. It's tagtago. It depicts a human being, depicts our ancestors. It may be thrown away or it may be used in ceremonies. So in the picture on the right are picture of Mombakis or Ifugao shamans. And I don't know if you could see there are two bulul also or bulul uh, as part of the ceremony. So this is a rice ritual. Usually, you see bululs as decorations or in museums or even in in for sale to buyers. But for the Ifugao, they are very important pieces that depict their identity. This is the Ivatan Vakul. The picture on the right is Vakul. So it's a raincoat worn on the head. So the picture on the left shows Ivatan women in Sabtang during the Vakul Kanayi festival there. The Vakul is worn by women. The Kanayi is like a raincoat worn by the men. So outsiders describe it as a Tina Turner hat. Usually, it's not worn during the sunny times of the day, but only when it's rainy. But once you have this, you know it's Ivatan. I've already mentioned Kalinga heirloom bead necklaces. So there may be beads that are antique. Some of them, such as carnelian beads, coming all the way from India and traded in early Philippine pre-Hispanic times. So I think the carnelian beads here, the ones that are red, are antique, but the other beads are more recent. So material culture may be old objects and therefore artifacts, or they may be recent ones that are recently produced. Some of the new beads in Kalinga are made out of plastic objects such as uh, the cap of a pen, a ball pen. They melt it and transform it into beads. This is the Maranao Torogan, so it's a traditional house of the Maranaos. Of course, you could easily identify them with the panolong, this wooden uh, pieces that jut out based on ochre designs. And so material culture can be as small as a bead or as big as a house, or maybe even bigger. So the picture on the right shows Maranaos during one ritual ceremony. So the malong, the umbrella, is also the fan are also symbols of identity of the Maranao. Now this is the Tawsu Kadis in Bahasa Sug or the Tausug language. It's called Kadis. Of course, in Malay, it's called Kris. In English, borrowed from Malay, it's called Kris. So it's a wavy sword and with a holder. Of course, in old Tagalog dictionaries, you will also see Kadis because that is also the Tagalog term for a Kris. But later, it became Kali among the Tagalog because of the baybayin dropping the final consonant, kalis, but the final S was not written in the ancient Tagalog script, so it became Kali, which is now associated with arnis. Synonym with arnis is Kali or stick fighting. And this is the Tiboli Tinala. So it's a Tiboli weaver. So these are abaca threads. The designs are based on dreams that the weaver dreamt about. That is why Tiboli Tinalak weavers are also called as dream weavers. They don't just create any design, but the designs are inspired by their dreams. So if you see Tinalak dresses, shirts, it may be a table runner, usually colored like that on the back as brown and white, so and black with tinges of red. So we know it's Tiboli. Of course, I told you a while ago certain material culture may be shared. So there are similar types of textile with neighboring groups. The indigenous people themselves will know, this is Tiboli. That's not Tiboli, that's Ubo, okay, a neighboring group. But for outsiders, because the Tiboli is more known to outsiders, usually they would say, that's a Tiboli Tinala. Okay, finally, letter Y, the Yakan piece. So it's a piece of textile usually worn as headdress. It's a head kerchief with geometric designs. Of course, there could be many designs. It could be bigger than a handkerchief, but the common thing would be geometric patterns. Okay. So those are some examples that I gave that are easily identifiable with particular groups. But we know there are many indigenous communities in the Philippines. And just to mention a few, what about the Ati? What about the Bontok, Bukidnon, Eskaya, Iranun, Iraya Mangyan, Itawit, Palawan, Remontado, Subanan, Teduray, Ubo? Do we know what types of material culture they have? Of course, they have material culture because they have dress, they have weapons, they have musical instruments. But do we know what types of material culture they have that are easily identifiable to their ethnic identity? Maybe some of the participants here could give examples. But to the broader public, the ones that I showed to you a while ago are the ones that are most common in the imagination of many Filipinos. So we have to do further research. about other groups of indigenous communities in the Philippines. Now, I told you about archaeology. And of course, our recent, since we're celebrating the quintercentennial in the Philippines, the 500th year of the arrival of Magellan together with Pigafetta and others. And you've probably heard that there was some fuss about whether Lapu Lapu was Cebuano or Tausug. A certain Filipino politician said, he is Tausug, he's not Cebuano. Okay? Of course, there's no proof in that. We don't know the language that Lapu Lapu used, but we have one clue. According to Pigafetta, the one of the weapons used by the members of Lapu Lapu's band of warriors, not Lapu Lapu himself, was a curved scimitar, which was called by the people in Cebu and Mactan as Kampilan. Okay. So it may be similar to this because it's curved, used by the Siao in northern Sulawesi. Okay. Now the Kampilan, unfortunately, is used by many communities from Sulawesi in Indonesia to Tagalogs and Ibanags in Luzon. But they were not indigenous to the Tausug. The Kadis is more identifiable with the Tausug, while the Kampilan was with the Maguindanao and the Maranao and the Tagalogs, the Visayans. Okay. So probably that is one evidence to show no, he's not Tausug. Of course, later on, we see this uh, shields showing the swords of Moro land, where the Kampilan is also there. But this is something recent. It is not something that was fashioned in the past. Now, to end my discussion, I'm raising several issues on or problem areas when we talk about indigenous material culture. Is the object itself indigenous or borrowed? So it may be the Kampilan may be indigenous to the Maranao and borrowed by the Visayans, for example. For me, this is not the debate. As long as people feel, as long as the indigenous people feel, this is very much a part of our identity. It really doesn't matter if it is original from that place or not. For example, we are very proud that a jeepney symbolizes the Philippines. But we know we fashioned a jeepney from the American jeep that we borrowed from the Americans. So it's not an issue of is it indigenous. What is important is its relevance to the members of the community. So for me, it let's not go to that debate unless our interest is who started it first. Second is it original or fake? Uh, right now, this is a pressing problem because China produces a lot of material culture that are fakes. You will see Persian rugs made in China. You will see ikat textiles supposedly woven by Igorots. But when you see, they are made in Shenzhen in China. So there are a lot of fakes. So I think this is important. Are the ones producing fakes, did they have any permit from the community where they took it? So that is one issue. Is it traditional or recent? Again, this is a non-issue because culture is dynamic. All cultures evolve. Therefore, even traditional cultures have changed. A bulul at present may be very difficult from a bulul during the pre-Hispanic period. Is the material culture exclusive identity marker of that particular group, or is it something shared? So, for example, the heirloom beads are shared among the Kalinga and not just to one particular tribe of the Kalinga. Is it popular or belonging to everyone in the community? Or is it an object of the elite, such as the datu, the chieftain? That we have to find out. Because maybe, yes, that's an emblem of the sultan, but even the subjects of the sultan are very proud that this is a marker of their sultanate, for example. However, it's still important to distinguish whether ordinary people wear that type of design or not. We know, for example, among death blankets in the Cordillera, there are certain designs that may be used by wealthy people or the baknang, and there are certain designs that are reserved for the poor, such as the nawatwat, the very poor ones. So it's a identity marker of that ethnic group, of that indigenous community, but belonging to a particular segment of that community. Now, do we instill the preservation of this material culture, or do we encourage continued production? I think it really depends on our agenda. If we talk about museums, of course, museums are one of the roles of museum is to preserve historical artifacts and objects. But if a culture is to survive and continue and thrive, then these types of material culture should be continuously produced. If they disappear, then the identity also disappears. Unfortunately, a while ago, I showed the picture of the Pasig pots. It was a tradition in Pasig from 1600 all the way to about 8 years ago, because now all uh, pottery making factories in Pasig have closed down. So it's now a dead uh, tradition in Pasig. But we could still revive it, because even traditions that have ceased to exist may be revived. Lastly, is the problem of, is it cultural appreciation or cultural appropriation? For example, and I do this, I may be guilty of this. So I may wear bahag, I may wear a Tiboli uh, a vest, okay, made of tinalak, and I'm very proud of it because I'm encouraging people to give worth to indigenous objects. But on the other hand, I may be accused of a cultural appropriation. No, you're not using it in its proper cultural context. For example, wearing certain textiles that are reserved for funeral practices. If it's a death blanket, you don't just wear it as a dress for fashion, or you don't just display it as a table piece, because these are sacred objects. So, for example, if you go to Bangkok, you will see posters saying Buddha is not a piece of decoration. So it may be true also for ritual objects of our indigenous peoples in the Philippines. We have to identify which ones are appropriate to display and which ones, no, they are reserved for indigenous peoples only, and only for their ritual ceremonies. So because our time is limited, I cannot go to which ones those are and which ones are not. I would want us to have more discussion about these things. I'm just looking at my clock. So here are the references that I used: Binford, Botchley, Castro, Gaskell, Jones, and Taylor. And I know you could download a recording of this later on and you can see those references. So let me end my talk with this. Thank you very much. If you have comments, we have time for discussion, but if we have very limited time, you could send me an email at ntcastro1 at up.edu.ph. You could also follow me, like, and subscribe my YouTube channel. I have lectures there about maternal culture. Look at it in YouTube. Look for Nestor Castro or N Castro 87. Thank you very much.